over for them to say things like, what's this all about? Or to consciously process the words that they're paying attention to. So these experiments rarely have the kinds of controls in them that would allow us to determine that whatever effect is responsible for the experimental outcome is in fact an automatic process. That's where the process dissociation procedure and the method of opposition come in. On a couple of occasions, not very many, but there are a couple of experiments now in the literature in which experimenters have used Jacobi's method of opposition and process dissociation procedure to actually tease apart the relative contributions of automatic and controlled processing to various experimental outcomes. Here's an example. This is work by Larry Jacobi himself on what's known as the false fame effect. It's a classic experiment, a modern classic in social psychology. And what happens in this experiment is that subjects are brought in for a memory experiment, and they're asked to study a list of names of people, okay? And some of the names are famous names like Margaret Thatcher, and some of the names are not famous names like one of them was Sebastian Weisdorf, okay? As far as anybody knows, is not famous. A day later, these same subjects were brought back to the laboratory, and they were told, what we'd like you to do now is to read this list of names and to just tell us whether it's the name of a famous person or not. Okay? So Margaret Thatcher, yeah, that's the name of a famous person. This time, when the subjects were presented with non-famous names like Sebastian Weisdorf, they tended to indicate that those objectively non-famous names were in fact the names of famous people. The explanation for the effect is that there was an automatic, non-conscious priming effect that took place that by virtue of the previous day's experiment, the subjects found names like Sebastian Weisdorf more familiar than they were before. They said, oh, yeah, I've heard that name. Must have come up on the news recently or something like that. And so they erroneously judge that that name is famous. That's the general explanation for the false fame effect. Jennings and Jacobi took the false fame effect and applied the process dissociation procedure to it in 3 different conditions in an attempt to estimate the contributions of conscious and unconscious processing to the effect. I will spare you the details of how they applied the method of opposition. It's interesting, but I don't have time. I'll spare you the calculations. Let's just give it to me that Jennings and Jacobi did the calculations right. And what you see here is the estimate of the strength of conscious and automatic processes, controlled and automatic processes, to this error that's known as the false fame effect. Under experimental conditions of full attention, where all the subjects were doing was memorizing studying the word list and then making the fame judgments, you can see here that in fact conscious processing dominated performance on the task, was overwhelmingly more important than automatic processing on the task. When the subjects were distracted by a second task while they were making the fame judgments, then what you get is a mix, a balance between automatic and controlled processes. And then when they ran a group of elderly people who have bad memories to begin with, kind of bad memories, not so bad, but worse than yours, they also showed this kind of balance between automatic and controlled processes. But the important condition here is the full attention condition, because that is the laboratory condition that most closely approximates what people are like in the ordinary course of everyday living. And what you see here is that controlled conscious processing makes the stronger contribution to task performance. Even when people are distracted by a second task, there's still a balance between controlled and automatic processing. There's nothing like the dominance on behavior of automatic processing. Here's another example. This is by James Uleman at NYU on spontaneous trait inferences. Again, make a long story short, subjects in this experiment viewed photographs of people who were unfamiliar to them, and each of these photographs was paired with a behavioral description like rescued the kitten or chided the waitress or something like that, okay? 2 days later, the subjects returned to the laboratory and they were again shown photographs, some old photographs, some new photographs, and simply asked to make trait judgments about these individuals based on their photographs, okay? Does this person look extroverted? Does this person look neurotic? Something like that. And it turned out that when the subjects made these trait judgments, the trait judgments were largely in line with the behavioral descriptions. So the person who was pictured, who was described as having rescued the kitten, was judged to be a kind person. The person who was associated with the behavioral description, chided the waitress, was characterized as a rude person, and so on. You kind of get the idea. Again, what Uleman concluded was that the behavioral descriptions automatically primed various kinds of trait inferences. That you went from the behavior, rescuing the kitten, to the trait kind automatically and thoughtlessly. Okay. Here comes the method of opposition and the process dissociation procedure. And again, in the standard condition of the experiment, where subjects make these trait judgments immediately after viewing the photographs, most of it's noise. Okay, so that's why these things don't sum to zero. But again, what you can see here is that conscious processing actually has a stronger influence than unconscious processing. After a 20-minute delay, when memory begins to fade, and especially after a 2-day delay when memory begins to fade, what you see here is more of a balance between conscious and unconscious processing, but nothing like the dominance on social behavior of automatic processing. It's just not there. One more example. This is known as the weapon bias, another very famous experiment, where subjects are shown pictures of individuals holding something in their hands, and what they have to do is make a judgment about whether what the person is holding in his hand is a weapon, like a revolver, or a tool, like a wrench. And in this experiment, which capitalizes, unfortunately, on racial biases in social perception, the subjects in this experiment were primed with presentations of either black African-American faces or white Caucasian European American faces. And what they found was that the subjects were more readily identified this ambiguous object as a weapon if they had been primed with the black African-American faces than if they were primed with the white European American faces. And the idea here is that there's this stereotypical association of race and crime, and that led people to make this automatic judgment, that the faces primed racial stereotypes, and the racial stereotypes contaminated people's judgments about whether this ambiguous object was a weapon or a tool. And again, the claim was this priming effect occurred automatically. Enter here in Payne's own experiment, again, the method of opposition and the process dissociation procedure. And what you can see here is that in whether you've got a black face priming behavior or a white face priming behavior, the overwhelming the source of this weapon bias comes from conscious processing, not from automatic processing. These are the only 3 experiments in the entire literature on automaticity and social behavior that have attempted to use something like the process dissociation procedure to tease apart the contributions of automatic and controlled processing, okay? And in each of these instances, it turns out that there just isn't the effect there. The only time you see conscious processing disappear here and be overwhelmed by automatic processing is in a special condition of the experiment where subjects had to make their judgments about the weapon against a strict deadline of 500 milliseconds, half a second. okay, about the time it takes you to step on the brakes of the car when you see the stoplights on the car ahead of you go on. Under those conditions, then the weapons bias turned out to be a product of automatic processing. But it should surprise nobody that if you require somebody to respond within half a second of the stimulus, that response is dominated by automatic processing. What else could it be dominated by? Okay? But that is not, unless you're a cop on the street, and maybe not even then, those are not the kinds of circumstances under which we make these judgments. So again, in each of these three experiments, when you look at the behavior under laboratory conditions that mimic the ordinary course of everyday living, what you see is that processing is not dominated by automatic processes. Task performance is not dominated by automatic processes. At the very worst, what you see is kind of an even-Steven 50-50 mix of conscious and automatic processing. We're going to skip these because I'm going to take them up. I'm going to take them up later. Okay. Oh, I took them out already. There we go. That's good. Okay. So now let's get back to the statement of automaticity theory, captured very nicely by Denise Park in a commentary published in the American Psychologist. The source of behavioral control comes not from active awareness, but from mental activations of which we are unaware, okay, and cues to which we're not attending. These are the articles in the special issue of American Psychologist then represent a fundamental breakthrough. Well, it turns out it's not so fundamental, okay, because when you in fact try to measure the contributions of controlled and automatic processing under ordinary circumstances, what you get is the dominance of controlled processing, not the dominance of automatic processing. Nevertheless, people still tend to go with the flow of automaticity, if you will. Here's Sandra Blakesley, a prominent popular science writer, okay. In navigating the world and deciding what is rewarding, humans are closer to zombies than sentient beings much of the time. Whether she'd go with John Barges' 99 and 44/100%, I don't know, but much of the time is still the conclusion. Here is Timothy Wilson, very prominent social psychologist at the University of Virginia. Freud's view of the unconscious was far too limited when he said that consciousness is the tip of the mental iceberg, which, by the way, Freud never said. Freud never used the iceberg metaphor, though everybody attributes it to him. When Freud said that consciousness is the tip of the mental iceberg, he was short of the mark by quite a bit. Consciousness may be more the size of a snowball on the top of that iceberg, an estimate that is very close to Barges' 99 and 44/100% unconscious. These are just examples to give you an idea of just how powerful this notion is. One more from the popular science writer Malcolm Gladwell, who about 10 years ago wrote a book called Blink, which kind of summarized and popularized a lot of these experiments, okay, arguing that the adaptive unconscious is really what dominates our behavior, that our thought and action, adaptive thought and action, really is controlled by processes that take place in the blink of an eye. Okay, so that's the general idea.